For more than 4 decades, he ruled Libya with flamboyance and fear. But tonight, after months on the run, Muammar Gaddafi is dead.
We came, we saw, he died.
On October 20, 2011, the Libyan despot, Muammar Gaddafi, was brutally killed by a coalition of NATO and National Transitional Council forces as part of the Libyan civil war. His death was part of a series of uprisings and revolutions called the Arab Spring, a period of large-scale protests in the Arab countries of Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain. People had enough of their authoritarian governments and wanted democracy. Since that day, Libya has descended into chaos, caught up in a deadly civil war, as Islamist insurgents struggled with secular forces and other interests to control the country. While the civil war technically ended in 2020, the country struggles to govern itself peacefully and democratically, and today the country is not safe and is a shell of what it once was under Gaddafi. Gaddafi's ambition was to create a pan-African state that bolstered Africa's presence and allowed for Africa to rival the Western world. He felt that Africa had to shed itself of its colonial past, considering it as a scar that never properly healed. Though this never actually came to be, he did help to create the prototype for Pan-African unity, the African Union. He had a bold vision of how African states should be governed. He used Libya as his ideological playground, creating a unique form of government that combines socialism, Islamic law, militarism, and authoritarianism. Blessed with vast oil reserves, Gaddafi had deep pockets. How did Gaddafi use architecture in the built environment as a tool for control? What did he keep and discard from the previous colonial era? How did Libya's colonial architecture help create Gaddafi in the first place? To find out, stick around, don't go anywhere. My name is Angelo, and this is Architecture with Angelo. We can't tell the story of Gaddafi without first telling the story of the Italians. Today we know Italy as being the boot of Europe, occupying a long, skinny peninsula that juts out from the snowy Swiss Alps into the warm Mediterranean Sea. But it wasn't always that way. For over 1,000 years, Italy was fragmented. No one authority controlled it since the fall of the Roman Empire. That all changed in the late 19th century when a man named Giuseppe Garibaldi led military campaigns to gradually unify the peninsula. The newly united Italy needed to legitimize itself to the international community, so it joined the colonial rat race of the 19th century. In its heyday, the Italians controlled a decent chunk of Africa north of the Sahara. The part of Africa that we care about for the sake of this video, now known as Libya, was annexed by the Italians from the declining Ottoman Empire. The region has been divided into Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzen. The region had a rich, complex history featuring Greek colonies, Roman cities, and later on Islamic cities, intermingling with Bedouin tribes in the vast desert. The Italians wanted these former Ottoman provinces as their own. They gave the Ottomans an ultimatum: concede or fight. The Ottomans fought and lost quickly. The Italo-Turkish War lasted just over a year, ending on October 18, 1912. The second that Italians conquered modern-day Libya, archaeologists went to work, excavating Roman ruins along the coastlines of their new colonies. These ruins were a source of national pride. To the Italian state, it legitimized their conquests and connected them to the Roman Empire. They honored ruins like the Triumphal Arch dedicated to Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor located in Tripoli. It was built under the rule of his son, Commodus. Meanwhile, architects face an important question. What architectural style would allow them to depict Italian colonists as dominant and wealthy, but also educated in the practices of local inhabitants and the long-standing customs? Did such a style even exist? Or do they have to make their own? The Italians had to prove themselves to the great powers of the world that they, too, deserved a seat at the table. When Benito Mussolini came to power, Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzen were in a state of disarray. No one was in clear control. Tribal disputes hindered an effective, unified anti-Italian alliance from forming, but the Italians were too incompetent to exploit the power vacuum and control their own colonies. Mussolini thought that made Italians look like a laughingstock. How could Italy conquer the world if it can't even fully conquer Tripoli and Benghazi? Under Mussolini's watch, Italy began what is known as the pacification of Libya. He appointed a businessman and politician named Giuseppe Volpi as the governor of Libya to bring about order and clean house. Volpi's strategy was to institute clear and direct rule from Rome, through him. He described it as neither with the chiefs or against the chiefs, but without the chiefs. The Italian state's primary enemies were part of the Senussi Order, a Muslim Sufi Brotherhood militant group that sought to free Libya from outside control. They were especially active in Cyrenaica and controlled vast swaths of Bedouins to their cause. The response of the Italians was so devastating and scarring for the Libyan people, many consider it to be a genocide. What does this response have to do with architecture and the urban planning and design of Libya? Well, as a genocide, this tragedy was devastating for towns, cities, and farms with the indigenous population. Generation after generation living in the same area were used to being ruled by outsiders, the Ottomans, but under much more stable conditions than what they were experiencing under the Italians. Turkish rulers shared a religion with the Libyans and didn't launch large-scale displacement campaigns like the Italians. The native population was deeply linked to their homes, schools, mosques, market spaces, and other features of their built environment. The Bedouins were used to roaming freely throughout the countryside and desert, following the patterns of their ancestors and living a nomadic life. The Italians were Christian outsiders that wanted to dominate, not cohabitate, the built environment of Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzen. They saw the future of these colonies as being Italian. The greatest impact of Libya's built environment was not in the cities, as they were already built up. Yes, Italians peppered infrastructure and some flashy buildings and apartments in these cities. These cities had an Italian district of some kind with a lot of Italian architecture, but the Islamic character fundamentally remained intact. The Italian government instead targeted rural farmland for the settler colonial project. They wanted the land for themselves. They used the excuse of quelling rebellion to justify their goal of eliminating as many indigenous people as possible. People were forced out of their homes and towns and were sent on death marches or were worked to death in concentration camps. The Italians used chemical weapons as well in their fight against rebels, with civilians intentionally being caught in the crossfire. While the primary goal was to quell rebellions in the Italian colonies, the collateral damage on the civilian population was allowed and encouraged. It resulted in up to half the Bedouin population being wiped out and almost 1 million people dying in total in the genocide. When the dust finally settled and the last of the rebel groups finally surrendered, the Italians won. Libya was theirs. Fascist architecture in Libya sought to create two Libyas, one for Italians and the other for the native population. An Italian Libya was to be modern and fascist. It was supposed to be a land of opportunity for native Italians. Propaganda encouraged the poor to emigrate to Libya and start fresh, instead of taking the long voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. They could farm and raise families in Libya's vast countryside, now cleared for Italians after the native Libyans were forcibly removed from their lands. The fascist government constructed dozens of settlements in Libya's interior, letting Italians fulfill their Libyan dream. Why go all the way to America when you could just take a short boat ride across the Mediterranean? 150,000 Italians would end up taking the bait, leaving their native Italy behind and starting a new life in Africa. New settlements were built cheaply and quickly for Italians in an architectural style called rationalism. Rationalism sought to be middle ground between the ornate neoclassicism and the futurist styles. It embraced the clean lines and white walls of modernism, but remained committed to the symmetry and order of neoclassical architecture. Settlements popped up and were named after Italian heroes such as Baracca, Garibaldi, Filossi, Crispi, and Tassoldi. A total of 26 villages sprouted up in only a few years. Each settlement contained structures like a church, government building, school, and small hospital. Farmland was dotted with houses built by the government. Meanwhile, the government built settlements for native Libyans. These settlements were a bit different. Muslims that were willing to support the Italians were able to work as sedentary farmers under contracts, not unlike sharecroppers. Muslim villages had a mosque, school, community area, and a hospital. Notice one key difference between the two village designs. In the Italian villages, fascist party offices had an equal significance as the churches, meaning Italians had the capacity and control, in theory, to be close to where the action is in power. The native Libyans, meanwhile, did not have such a building in their settlements. Yes, the Libyans who cooperated with the Italians could get a slim chance of enjoying modern-day amenities like schools, running water, and medical care. Several Muslim villages were constructed by the government in this manner, but the lack of civic space in their settlements were a constant reminder that these settlements were the equivalent of bread and circuses, meant to keep them satisfied and docile. And access to settlements like this were the exception, not the norm, for native Libyans. This built up resentment among the locals for their rulers. Libya, as an important Italian colony, was swept up in World War II. Britain led military campaigns to capture Libya, and the Italians and Germans fought to keep it in the hands of the Axis powers. Vast swaths of Libya were bombed during the war, leaving native Libyans caught up with and fighting on behalf of a cause they did not have a choice in participating in. They saw carnage and experienced trauma from the war. After Italy lost the war, they had to give up Libya to the Allies. Then, in 1951, Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzen were united once again under the rule of King Idris I. Libyans showed staunch resistance to colonial rule throughout the war and during the period of military occupation. Libyans wanted independence, and someone needed to step up. Idris was a member of the Sanusi order, a religious brotherhood that was created in the early 19th century that sought to convert non-Muslim Bedouin tribes to Islam. The founder of the order, al-Sanusi, was the grandfather of Idris. The movement emerged as a political force in Cyrenaica and became the closest thing to unifying Libya. The order worked hard in World War II, fighting alongside the Allies to defeat the Italians. The British remembered that, supporting King Idris's ascent to the throne. King Idris also got the go-ahead from tribal leaders who saw him as a compromise candidate and agreed to accept him out of a desire for consensus. When King Idris ascended to the throne in 1951, Libya was unified on paper, and that's about it. In reality, thousands of years of cultural and societal differences between Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan prevented actual unity. How could a nomadic Fezzan and town-dwelling Tripolitanian collaborate in the creation of a modern state? Literacy was low, natural resources were low, and the country was impoverished, perhaps with the exception of the Italians who stayed in Libya. Right off the bat, there was an uphill battle for the king. Plus, the Libyan constitution gave the king sweeping powers. The king played favorites, assembling an entourage of loyalists who lived extravagantly. The king preferred to rule away from the power center of Tripoli, and instead chose to govern from his native Cyrenaica, away from the action of Tripoli, isolating himself in the process. Plus, the king did not have an apparent successor, so the longevity of his regime and the dynastic rule that legitimizes monarchies was called into question by the masses. The regime's strategy was to buy influence from competing regions. His hope was that different groups in Libya would be too busy quarreling amongst themselves to mobilize an effective opposition. That seemed to work for around a decade, until Libya finally changed forever.
But Libyans look to the future rather than the past. Part of their future is hidden beneath the sands of the Sahara Desert. Here is an air view of the area, which the government has leased in concessions to several European and American oil companies. Esso Standard Libya was the first company to find oil there in 1958 in the Fezzan province.
This sent shockwaves throughout Libya. Its society and built environment would change forever. Libya's architecture in the cities was mostly Arab, with some Italian influence. The cities under Mussolini King Idris underwent significant modernization in 50 years. In the countryside, meanwhile, poverty was still commonplace, and the fascist experimental villages in the 1930s tended to be either decaying and unoccupied, or occupied by what Italians were still left in Libya. Europeans and Americans, meanwhile, saw Libya as more of a place for military bases, or to go on a cheap vacation. Opportunity outside the cities was limited for Libyans. When European and American companies started drilling in the Sahara, things changed quickly and drastically. Vast swaths of Libyans left thousands of years of subsistence farming behind to find work in the oil fields and the cities. Libya became a net importer of foodstuffs as a result, as rapid urbanization took place. All of a sudden, oil wealth was emerging and was trickling down into other aspects of Libyan society. Prices rose, demand for housing soared in cities, income inequality rose, and new groups of Libyans emerged, an educated intelligentsia plugged into the Western world, a burgeoning working class whose efforts to organize were thwarted by the government oil companies, and a young population itching for reform. Throughout the 1960s, the office of the Prime Minister faced high turnover, as nobody was equipped to handle the day-to-day management of Libya's mounting social challenges. People's demands were wide-ranging, from more housing and healthcare to less Western involvement in society. In 1967, tensions reached the boiling point after people protested Libya's involvement in the Six-Day War, a conflict between Israel and various Arab states. Israel decisively won the war, and it led to Libyans protesting the close relationship between Libya and the United States, Israel's closest ally. The public didn't like how the United States had a military base either, believing that the government was complicit in the perpetuation of Israel and the Zionist project. In 1969, the military overthrew the monarchy in a bloodless coup after a series of quote-unquote reformers failed to actually change anything. King Idris would be in exile for the rest of his life. The Revolutionary Command Council took over, pledging to clean up corruption, raise living standards, and be more proactive on international issues, particularly involving Israel. A new sheriff was in town, Lieutenant Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi. Why was Gaddafi able to control Libya so easily? The transfer of power was quick, and most people were on board before Gaddafi's regime even started to criminalize dissent. Well, the answer goes back to architecture and the built environment. During the colonial and monarchical eras, Libyans saw a Libya being created that was not in their control. The Islamic architectural splendor of their cities became shared by Italian structures. The land they farmed on for thousands of years was taken by the Italians very quickly. The oil fields sprouting up in their vast desert were controlled by Christian foreigners, with companies getting the most benefits. The oil wealth was not translating into improved material conditions for enough people. When Libyans looked at their cities, they saw decadence that primarily served the Libyan elite, as well as foreigners from Europe and the United States. They were fed up being controlled by others and wanted to control their own destiny. When Gaddafi took power, things changed very quickly. Some changes were dictatorial, others were outrageous, and other changes contributed to making Libya have one of the highest standards of living in Africa. Here's what happened. When Gaddafi became the ruler of Libya, he ruled over disputing tribes, 3 distinct regions, and other Americans and Europeans that did not flee immediately after the military coup. At the same time, he had to live up to his promises to clean up the country of corruption and foreign interference, particularly regarding Libya's vast oil reserves. He needed to create a Libyan identity centered around what became known as Gaddafiism. He felt that the government should be run according to his third universal theory, part of his manifesto, the Green Book. It outlined a system of direct democracy, where the masses formed groups and, through consensus, participated in government. This did not manifest in much democracy in practice, as Gaddafi was a dictator whose word was the final say, no matter what. Economically, he claimed to be a socialist. He redistributed a chunk of the revenue from oil extraction to fund infrastructure projects, social programs, housing, healthcare, etc. Of course, he also lined his pockets in the process. His foreign policy, meanwhile, was quite simply us versus them. He believed that Africa and the Arab world should form close economic and military ties in order to empower themselves and serve as a counterweight to Western hegemony. Gaddafiism to Muslim Libyans was a double-edged sword. They lived under a dictatorship and in practice did not have much of a say in their own government, but their quality of life improved drastically as the oil money improved their material conditions. Gaddafi, as a man with a huge ego, wanted Libyans to be constantly reminded of how he was benefiting them and how it was his regime that was improving their lives. He began by changing street and place names in the cities, removing street names that were given by the Italians and changed them to be revolutionary dates. Names of Gaddafi and his family members, Islamic figures, and whatnot. Changing street names has a psychological effect on the population as it conveys power and importance. For example, this square in Tripoli is now called Martyr Square. Under Gaddafi's rule, it was called Green Square. During the reign of King Idris, it was called Independence Square. When the Italians were in charge, it was called Piazza Italia. Located next to Martyr Square used to be an Italian theater called the Real Teatro Miramare. It was a colonial hub for the arts. It was an example of Italian colonial architecture before the fascists took over. When Gaddafi took over, he had the theater destroyed. Part of the reason why he did this was because the theater was a symbol of cultural and political domination from the Italian era, and to Gaddafi, this structure was not worth keeping. Other colonial structures remained but were remodeled and renamed, such as the Jamal Abdul Nasser Mosque, which used to be the Tripoli Cathedral. What used to be a symbol of Catholicism and Italian colonialism was converted to a mosque by Gaddafi. The structure of the church remained intact, but the facade and interior underwent significant alterations. Some structures were, of course, destroyed by Gaddafi, like the Arco del Fellini or the Marble Arch. It was built during the Italian era on the Libyan Coastal Highway, a road originally built by the Italians. It marked the boundary between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. Built in the neoclassical style, it was inspired by the surrounding Greco-Roman ruins, connecting the Italians to classical antiquity. Gaddafi wanted this monument destroyed, considering a relic of an oppressive era, and it was destroyed a few years into his reign. Meanwhile, Gaddafi built from scratch ambitious construction projects that ranged from ostentatious monstrosities to beneficial projects that actually helped Libyan people. The government, in keeping with his purported socialist values, frowned upon private property. In the Green Book Part 2, he declared that there was no freedom for a man who lives in another's house, whether he pays rent or not, instituting laws that allowed for tenants to own their own property. The government also built hundreds of thousands of housing units in Libyan cities, with shanty towns being cleared in the process. These modern tower blocks, while being utilitarian and dull, did give Libyans a roof over their heads. They gave ordinary Libyans a standard of living uncommon in Africa. Gaddafi also initiated ambitious infrastructure projects throughout the country, including the Great Man-Made River, the largest irrigation project in the world. It brings water from aquifers in Libya's vast desert to northern cities and farmlands, providing drinking water and allowing for more arable land. Projects like these contributed to Libya being the most developed country in Africa by the year 2010. However, Gaddafi could not get in the way of his own paranoia and tyrannical tendencies. Not everyone received the same level of benefits from oil wealth. Different parts of Libya grew richer than others. While this concept on its own is a normal pattern of development, in the case of Libya, it was largely a result of Gaddafi's will. He gave certain tribes better housing and access to public services. For example, he gave the Tawarga tribe access to highly productive farmland. Gaddafi's tribe was close to their tribe and they were favorable towards him. He gave them high-quality housing featuring modern amenities and gave them access to high-paying civil service jobs. This led to resentment among surrounding tribes who did not receive such favorable treatment. As tribespeople abandoned their nomadic lifestyles and urbanization, Gaddafi resettled them in more desirable areas if he liked them. other tribes saw their settlements decay and decline, resulting in two distinct versions of Libya emerging. The first Libya, for the tribes and towns that Gaddafi liked, had modern housing blocks with the standards of living not far off from European countries. The second Libya was being left behind and got a smaller slice of the oil wealth pie. This divide eventually grew into a divide between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. Tripolitania had Gaddafi's favorite tribes and became wealthy and affluent. Cyrenaica, meanwhile, saw economic hardship despite being the region where the oil reserves were actually located. Cyrenaica also used to be where the power center for King Idris was, so Gaddafi was inherently resentful of the region. Benghazi, Libya's second city, got less money for infrastructure and housing than Tripoli, the capital. When Gaddafi first took over, Benghazi, just like Tripoli, was an eclectic mixture of Ottoman, Italian, and modernist influences. During his rule, however, the city fell into a state of decay. The downtown was a primary location for paved roads, and Benghazi's suburbs often did not have sewage systems and tended to have poor public services. People in Benghazi and Cyrenaica at large could not help but notice this divide. They were being deliberately left behind. Instead of preserving the city's historic core and expanding the rest of the city with modern housing and infrastructure like in Tripoli, Gaddafi left Benghazi to basically rot. As a result, rebellions were concentrated in Cyrenaica, causing Gaddafi to dislike the region even more, creating a vicious cycle. By the first decade of the 21st century, Libya began opening itself up to the international community, undertaking initiatives like ending its weapons of mass destruction program and supporting the West in the global war on terror. Gaddafi also engaged in public-private partnerships to entice investment and development in his country. However, by this time, the divide between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica was glaring. Gaddafi poured enormous resources in cementing Tripoli as a modern and affluent city, complete with skyscrapers and resorts. New construction projects were meant to attract foreigners and make the country a tourist destination as Libya was opening itself up to the outside world. Projects like the Corinthia Hotel, a 5-star hotel situated along Tripoli's waterfront, were elaborately decorated and conveyed Gaddafi's vision for Tripoli. The JW Marriott Hotel, also located along Tripoli's waterfront, was partially funded by the Libyan government as another 5-star skyscraper hotel. This served the same role as the Corinthia Hotel in making Tripoli appear open and modern to foreigners. In 2007, the Libyan government and architecture firm Foster & Partners announced the Green Mountain Sustainable Development Area, named after the fertile and forested region in Cyrenaica. A large amount of land was to be set aside for luxury hotels, golf courses, housing, and natural reserves. At the same time, the government would partner with UNESCO to preserve the ancient Greek ruins of the region, most notably being the city of Cyrene. The government touted this as a job creator and tourism boom, giving the impoverished region thousands of jobs and allowing for the region to not be overly developed in the process. This project, however, was more a flashy spectacle than substantive improvement for Cyrenaica. Instead of, for example, launching a public works campaign to pave roads in Benghazi suburbs, the government chose a flashier option. The man who spearheaded the effort, Saif al-Islam, was trying to curry favor from his father by launching this project to boost his odds of taking over Libya when Gaddafi died or stepped down. Poverty and illiteracy were still high in this region, and if this project actually happened, it would not actually do much to tackle these systemic issues. In 2011, the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East, ousting leaders and throwing countries into chaos. Not surprisingly, Cyrenaica was where protests first started. People in Benghazi took to the streets, protesting a regime that neglected their province and their city. Eventually, the struggle escalated and the whole country was engulfed in a civil war. Gaddafi's death in 2011 was followed by power struggles and chaos. Today, much of the country, especially in Cyrenaica, is in ruins, and the country is struggling to rebuild itself from the ashes. Libya's history has been tragic, being rife with violence and tyranny. From the Italians massacring Bedouins and Cyrenaicans to Gaddafi playing favorites with Libya's oil wealth, the country has endured a century of trauma. This tragic story can be told through the lens of architecture, as authoritarian leaders impose their architectural fantasies and grandiose infrastructure projects on the people. Their inflated sense of ego makes them believe that they have the right to uproot thousands of years of cultural tradition and implant their own vision. From Italians setting up farms and homesteads in nomadic and agricultural lands, to Gaddafi divesting from Benghazi and propping up milquetoast, greenwashed neoliberal pet projects, the dictators think they can play God. Hopefully, when Libya eventually sorts itself out and becomes stable again, a new leader will emerge whose acts will actually reflect the will of the people. The country has enough oil wealth that everyone can have the opportunity to live comfortably, no matter what tribe or province they are from. Thanks for watching.